We ended the last lecture module by looking at this response or challenge to Gettier cases saying, hey, they all involve these false beliefs that are intermediaries in this inferential chain that links the initial belief to the target belief that Gettier wants to claim is justified, true, and believed. And because there's that false belief, there can't be any transference of justification through the inferences. We looked at the Counting Crow case in which I suggested you may not want to rule out every inference and every role that a false belief might play in an inference a priori wholehearted. So it looks too strong. Within the philosophical literature, the focus has really been on the fact that the objection looks too weak. It doesn't look like it actually rules out all the Gettier cases. And in particular, people like Feldman in his 1973 paper that you read reply that this objection is in fact too weak because we can generate these Gettier-type counterexamples that don't have false intermediary beliefs in the inferential chain. Now, Feldman published his paper in 73. In 1966, Chisholm uses an example like this, talking about inferences about sheep in a field. In his book, Skirms, in 1967, gives a number of examples, a barometer example, a pyromaniac example, that illustrate this same point. They have inferences don't involve any intermediary false beliefs, and yet they seem to work as Gettier cases. Feldman's own example involves Smith coming to believe that someone in his office owns a Ford. Alvin Goldman, who graciously credits Carl Gannett with the insight, also gives an example of Smith forming a belief that he sees a barn where the belief looks like it's justified and it's true, but it doesn't seem to count as knowledge. And I think that one's a very intuitive example. When we think about Smith driving through, say, Wisconsin, he's looking around, he's seeing barns everywhere, and he's making these inferences. There's a barn, there's a barn, there's a barn, there's a barn. Now, unbeknownst to old Smith, he enters into this part of the county where this performance artist has been creating and putting up papier-mâché barns, so that most of the barn-looking things that he sees from the road are in fact papier-mâché barns, so his beliefs would be false. Smith doesn't know this. He doesn't know that when he looks out, he sees that building over there. It looks like a barn. He makes an inference there's a barn. In fact, it's just a papier-mâché facade. There is no barn. However, there are still some barns around because the performance artist doesn't get all the barns torn down as well. And so as Smith's driving along, he looks out, he sees a barn. Based on the way it looks, he says, oh, there's a barn. He's got a belief. The belief seems to be justified given what Smith knows. There are no false intermediary beliefs anywhere in this chain. And so it looks like Smith has a justified true belief. But we don't want to say that Smith knows precisely because he's now in performance artist land. And his belief, in fact, would turn out to be quite unreliable if he just started forming beliefs like this all the time. Most of those beliefs would turn out to be false while he's in this area. So these examples seem to illustrate that it's not the case that it's a difficulty with an intermediary false belief in these cases. As Feldman suggests, it looks like the big problem here is that the belief is formed using evidence, but the evidence is misleading. The evidence is evidence that normally would count towards having that belief be justified. But unbeknownst to the reasoner, there is this other mitigating information that the reasoner is not aware of or has access to, and that mitigating information undermines the normal relationship between the information the reasoner does have and the belief that they do form. And this seems to be the general feature of these Gettier cases. Their cases were based on justifying but misleading evidence. You tell a story whereby the person makes an inference. That inference looks like a really just perfectly fine inference. That inference results in them making a belief, or you give them some evidence. They form a belief on the basis of that evidence that's normally good evidence. But then you tell this story about how there's these weird circumstances, or there's some condition that undermines the connection that inference or that belief forming mechanism depends upon. And though they don't know it, that belief forming mechanism is no longer as useful, as reliable. The relationship between the evidence and the conclusion really isn't one that would justify it in these circumstances, though normally it would. and so on. The response then that philosophers have adopted is to say, okay, look, knowledge is justified true belief. That's okay. We got those necessary conditions down. Now all we got to do is just add another necessary condition to get the jointly sufficient conditions. I believe Feldman mentions this in the article. It's often referred to as a warrant clause. And the idea is knowledge is justified true belief plus this other stuff. And this stuff makes sure that the justification isn't misleading, that the evidence is really good evidence for the belief. Now, there are a number of different ways that philosophers have tried to cash this out. One way is a way that has been opted by Tom Paxton and Roderick Chisholm and Keith Lair. And they adopt this strategy of saying, yeah, the counterexamples work against that. But actually, knowledge is justified true belief with no undefeated defeaters. Now, what does that mean? Well, a defeater is some information that if you knew it, it would take away your justification. And a defeater is just a bit of information that would take away the ability of that initial information to undermine your belief. In other words, you've got a belief that's justified. Oh, here's some information that undermines the justification. That's a defeater. Oh, wait, here's some information that undermines the undermining of the justification. So you are justified. I remember once a professor I had explained how he thought this was supposed to work in real life. It's like you're walking through this epistemic valley of death. And on one side, there are all these defeaters, and they're trying to shoot you. They're trying to undermine your reasons for your beliefs. On the other side of that valley, there are all these other defeaters, and they're trying to shoot the defeaters so that they can undermine your beliefs. They can't shoot you. And then there's this enormous explosive puff of smoke. And if you're still standing there, then you knew it. I think that's a very poignant way of characterizing the feasibility theory. I'm sure Lair would be very upset with me for doing that, but I think that really does kind of capture the spirit of it. So my claim would be that this response is too strong. I mean, ask the following questions. What are the cognitive relevance of such defeaters? What are the cognitive relevance is the bit of information that you don't have, that if you did have it would undermine it? How does that affect your sense of justification? And the defeater that would defeat that you also don't have, how does that affect it? And is knowledge possible at all on this account other than just having true belief regardless? And it seems like it's not clear. It seems like this view kind of introduces this covert requirement of omniscience. You have to have a belief. That belief has to be one that would survive the valley of epistemic death. Otherwise, it's not good. And the only way you could ever get that kind of belief forming on a regular basis, it seems to be, would be if you could just rule out all the possible defeaters and defeaters and so on. So I'm not very sympathetic to this view. It certainly is a well-trodden path in epistemology. Another example was an example forwarded by Fred Dredske. So Dredske tries to respond to Gettier cases and tries to formulate a theory of knowledge based upon what he calls conclusive reasons. And so Dredske says, S knows that P, if S has a reason R, such that if P were false, S wouldn't have R. And so the idea there is that counterfactually, if you didn't have that reason, you wouldn't form the belief. If the belief were false, if it wasn't the case that what you believe is true, you wouldn't have that reason, and hence you wouldn't form the belief. And so conclusive reasons are reasons that always seem to counterfactually correlate you with the truth. Dredske abandoned this view as both too weak. I mean, you could know that there was a cup on the table if it was causing you to see a cup on the table, but that cup was actually a holographic projection around another cup. So that you have that evidence, and you only have that evidence because there's a cup on the table, and yet that doesn't seem to make you justified in your belief that there's a cup on the table. It also seems too strong. It rules out all knowledge based upon high probability. That correlation has to be such that if it wasn't the case, then you wouldn't have the evidence and you wouldn't form the belief, period. And probabilistic inferences don't have that structure. They take a certain amount of epistemic risk. And so as a result, the counterfactuals approach doesn't seem to have much promise, I think, either. Finally, there's Goldman's approach. In A Causal Theory of Knowledge, Goldman suggests that knowledge is belief where the fact that P is causally connected in an appropriate way with S's believing that P. And this view has had pretty wide acceptance in the literature, and we'll look at it next week when we read that paper.